There is a strange and often painful phenomenon that many experience yet seldom understand: the sudden, unexplained shift in how others treat us. One day, you are welcomed, praised, or at least tolerated. The next, you're met with coldness, distance, or even hostility. It is rarely spoken, it comes without announcement, and it wounds without weapon. This, my friends, is the silent war, the invisible rebellion others may wage against you when your light begins to shine too brightly for their shadowed comfort. Today, let us walk through the depths of this human tension to uncover the unconscious motives that fuel hidden resentment and why your growth, yes, your growth may be the very reason for their silent hatred. When you begin to grow, truly grow, not just in ways others can see, like wealth or status, but in the silent chambers of your soul, something begins to shift in the energy you carry. It is not always visible to you, but it becomes deeply uncomfortable for others. You begin to carry yourself differently. There is a quiet confidence that emerges when you start healing the wounds that once dictated your reactions. You stop seeking validation from the very people who once had the power to break you. You begin to move with intention rather than obligation. And this, though it may seem harmless to you, can feel like a direct threat to those who are still trapped in their own unconscious patterns of behavior. In their eyes, something about you has changed. They can't explain it clearly, nor will they admit it openly, but it disturbs them. What disturbs them is not your success, not even your transformation. It's the mirror you now unknowingly hold up to their unhealed selves. You start reminding them of the parts they've ignored, the choices they've postponed, the truths they've refused to face. You no longer fit within the identity they had of you, and now they must either evolve themselves or attack the new version of you that they do not understand. Insecurity doesn't always announce itself with jealousy or envy. Often, it shows up as criticism masked as concern, or as distance disguised as being busy. The more you elevate internally, the more your very presence will start to expose the dissonance in others. It is not your fault, and yet it becomes your burden to carry until you learn to no longer absorb it as rejection. Their reaction to your growth is not a reflection of your wrongdoing. It is a sign of their inner conflict being awakened. You see, people are not threatened by your strength unless it exposes their weakness. They are not disturbed by your peace unless it reminds them of their chaos. The more you anchor into who you truly are, the more you will unintentionally challenge those who have built their identity on false foundations. Perhaps you were once someone who played small to make others comfortable, who stayed silent to avoid confrontation, or who apologized simply to keep the peace. But now, you begin to realize the cost of those compromises. You stop over-explaining, you stop shrinking, you stop seeking permission, and that shift, that invisible act of reclaiming your power, becomes the very thing that others interpret as arrogance, as rebellion, or even as betrayal. You're no longer playing the role they cast you in. You no longer depend on their praise to feel valuable. This, to them, is not just growth, it's abandonment. They don't know how to respond to the version of you that no longer needs them in the way you once did. And so, they distance themselves, criticize you, or worse, begin to gossip about you, but they don't hate you because you've wronged them. They hate you because you've outgrown the dynamic they once controlled. Your evolution reminds them of their own emotional paralysis. It brings up all the things they've buried, and the truth is, not everyone is ready to look in that mirror. Some will make you the villain in their story because it's easier than admitting they've stayed stagnant while you dared to move forward. The discomfort they feel in your presence is not caused by anything you've done directly. It's the unspoken contrast between who they are pretending to be and who you are becoming without pretending anymore. Projection is one of the most deceptive yet powerful forces in the unconscious mind. People often believe they are reacting to others when, in truth, They are responding to reflections of themselves that they see in others. When someone suddenly begins to dislike you, to criticize you, or to treat you with unwarranted coldness, it is rarely about who you truly are. More often than not, it is a projection of their own fears, inadequacies, or hidden wounds being cast onto you like a film on a screen. The human psyche cannot always bear to confront the parts of itself that are unresolved or repressed, so it externalizes those parts onto others as a survival mechanism. This is how hatred often disguises itself as righteousness, how judgment cloaks insecurity in the language of morality, and how rejection becomes a tool for self-preservation when someone is deeply uncomfortable with a part of themselves. Perhaps their neediness, their insecurity, their lack of boundaries or ambition. They may begin to see that very trait in you, even if it isn't truly there. You might become the scapegoat for emotions they refuse to own. You might notice they accuse you of being selfish when you're merely practicing self-care. They may call you cold when you're simply asserting boundaries. They might say you're full of yourself when you're finally beginning to acknowledge your worth. These accusations are not rooted in truth, but in the distorted lens through which they view the world and themselves. The more authentic and self-aware you become, the more you will unknowingly stir the unconscious contents of others. Your clarity may highlight their confusion. Your discipline may provoke their procrastination. Your emotional freedom may expose the chains they still wear in silence. Because they have not yet made peace with their own shadows, they project them outward and turn you into the problem rather than facing the difficult work of introspection. It is far easier for someone to blame you than it is to sit with the discomfort of their own emotional dissonance. Instead of asking themselves, "Why does this person trigger me?" they simply label you as the enemy, as if your existence alone is an offense to their fragile self-concept. This process is rarely conscious. The person projecting may truly believe their feelings toward you are valid and justified. They may craft stories about your intentions, twist your words, and reinterpret your behavior through the filter of their unresolved trauma. You become a character in a narrative that has little to do with your reality. And because projection is rooted in emotional memory, not logic, even your attempts to explain yourself will often fall on deaf ears. They're not listening to understand you. They are listening to defend the version of you they have created in their mind over time. The more this happens, the more you realize that people don't see you as you are. They see you as they are. Their perception is a mirror reflecting back their inner landscape, not a window offering a clear view of who you actually are. This understanding becomes liberating because it teaches you not to take things personally. You stop trying to win over those who have already decided you are wrong simply because your presence unsettles something unhealed within them. You begin to realize that what they're at war with isn't you. It's the unresolved tension they carry and the illusion that harming you might silence it in this way. Projection becomes a silent but destructive form of warfare. You may walk into a room and feel hostility without cause, sense envy behind polite words, or become the target of criticism that makes no sense to your actual behavior. This is not madness, nor is it coincidence. It is the unconscious mind attempting to rid itself of discomfort by making someone else the container for its pain, and the more aware you become of this dynamic, the less power it holds over you to live in truth, is to disrupt the comfortable illusions that surround you. Authenticity, while celebrated in theory, is often feared in practice, not because it is wrong or offensive, but because it reveals. When you begin to live as your truest self, no longer pretending, no longer conforming to the expectations others placed upon you, you automatically create discomfort in those who have not yet allowed themselves that same freedom. Your authenticity becomes a silent challenge, not by force or intention, but simply by existing outside of the social script. You become a walking contradiction to their carefully maintained persona, and this contradiction demands attention, demands explanation, demands inner confrontation. They may not be ready for the act of being genuine, exposes the artificial. When you choose not to lie about what you feel, when you speak your truth even when it trembles in your throat, you shed layers that others are still clinging to, and in doing so, you threaten their emotional equilibrium. They may not even understand why your presence unsettles them, why they feel the urge to dismiss you, to silence you, to exclude you. But beneath the surface, what disturbs them is not that you have changed, but that you are revealing a possibility they haven't dared to explore in themselves. You are showing that one can live without masks, without manipulation, without the exhausting burden of performing for approval, and that very idea can be terrifying to someone who has built their entire identity on being liked, accepted, or praised. Authenticity, in this way, is not loud. It is not attention-seeking, but it is undeniably powerful. It strips away illusion without saying a word. People who live in denial feel that power as a threat because it implies they too could choose differently, that they too have the capacity to stop pretending. But the cost of such a realization is high. It would mean facing the choices they've made out of fear, the relationships they've maintained out of obligation, the silence they've kept out of guilt or shame. Rather than confront that pain, it is easier to turn their discomfort into resentment toward you. You become the problem simply because you remind them that they are not yet free. There is something unsettling about someone who no longer needs validation. It creates a power dynamic that cannot be controlled. When you are rooted in your truth, you no longer depend on others to define your worth, and that makes you untouchable in a way that disrupts the emotional economy of manipulation. People who are used to controlling others through guilt, approval, or rejection find themselves powerless in your presence. They may try to label you too intense, too distant, too proud, but those labels are merely attempts to re-establish the roles they are comfortable with, roles in which you are smaller, quieter, more manageable. But when you refuse to return to that version of yourself, the version that made them feel secure, they do not respond with celebration. They respond with fear masked as criticism, contempt disguised as concern, and subtle hostility dressed up as emotional distance. This is why authenticity often leads to loss, not because you are doing something wrong, but because your presence no longer supports the illusions others depend on. You become too honest for the dishonest, too clear for the confused, too grounded for the unstable. People don't always hate authenticity because it is harmful. They hate it because it is revealing. And what it reveals is the internal conflict they have worked so hard to suppress. Your truth becomes a kind of mirror they cannot escape, and in that reflection, they see the gap between who they are and who they want to be, between the life they live and the life they dream about, between their spoken values and their actual choices. And rather than closing that gap, rather than growing into their own authenticity, they choose to distance themselves from the one who reminds them it exists. When people start to pull away from you without explanation, when their energy shifts from warmth to coolness, when they respond with vague silences, unreturned messages, or shallow smiles that once held genuine light, you may begin to wonder what you did wrong. But often, what you're feeling is not confusion caused by your actions, but the result of a silent envy slowly taking root in someone else's heart. This kind of envy doesn't always explode into confrontation or visible hostility. It prefers the shadows. It thrives in subtle withdrawal, small omissions, and half-hearted interactions. It hides behind politeness while quietly eroding the bond you once shared. And what makes it even more disorienting is that it often comes from people you never expected to feel that way toward you. This envy is not always about material things. It isn't just about success, wealth, or accolades. More often, it is about your internal freedom, your emotional evolution, your growing sense of self-worth. It is about the peace you are starting to embody after years of struggling. It's about the fact that you've begun healing wounds they still protect. The calm in your eyes unsettles the chaos in theirs. The lightness in your presence becomes a quiet reminder of the weight they still carry but never speak of. And rather than being inspired, rather than rising with you, they choose to retreat, often while quietly hoping you stumble. Passive envy rarely announces itself. It does not always come with sharp words or loud declarations. Instead, it shows up in moments of withheld support, when they don't congratulate you on your growth, when they stop showing up when you need them, when they begin cheering for everyone but you. You may feel their absence more than hear their disapproval. They may remain physically present while emotionally withdrawing, offering surface-level words without the depth they once held. This is how the silent war unfolds, slowly, invisibly, and intimately. Because it does not look like hate, you may hesitate to name it as such. But deep down, you sense the change, and the lack of acknowledgement becomes its own form of rejection. You begin to realize that not everyone can celebrate the version of you that no longer needs saving. Some people were only comfortable with your pain because it mirrored their own. They felt bonded to you through shared wounds, and now that you've begun to heal, that connection feels threatened. They don't know how to relate to your strength. They miss the version of you who needed their validation, who played small so they could feel big, who tolerated things you now peacefully walk away from. And so, instead of growing alongside you, they create distance. Their silence becomes a wall. They may never say it, but somewhere inside them, they believe your light makes their darkness more visible, and that visibility feels unbearable in this way. The people who silently envy you will not always become enemies, but they will become strangers. The withdrawal may be disguised as busyness, as changed priorities, as growing apart. But underneath those excuses lies a discomfort they don't want to name. They are not angry at you. They are angry at themselves for staying still while you moved forward. But rather than confront their choices, they punish yours. They quietly hope life humbles you so that you return to the role they were comfortable with. And this resentment, though silent, can poison a connection more deeply than any spoken word. There is something profoundly disheartening about being the target of someone's unspoken resentment. It creates a sense of emotional dissonance. You still care for them, still wish them well, still remember the moments when things were real, yet you can no longer ignore the emptiness behind their eyes when they look at you, the tightness in their smile when you speak, the way their presence now feels like absence. And though they may never admit it, their energy speaks what their mouth won't. One of the most unsettling truths about human relationships is that your personal growth can trigger fear in others, not because you've harmed them, but because your evolution forces them to confront their own stagnation. As you begin to shift, internally and externally, those who once felt aligned with you may start to feel uncertain, even threatened. This fear is rarely spoken out loud. Instead, it simmers beneath the surface, showing itself through subtle tension, unexplained distance, or a change in the way they speak to you. It's not that they consciously resent your progress, but something within them begins to fear being left behind, forgotten, or exposed as unwilling to grow alongside you. When you begin to break patterns that once defined you, when you stop engaging in gossip, when you no longer tolerate disrespect, when you start prioritizing your mental health, your purpose, your boundaries, you stop being familiar to the people who still live inside those old patterns. You start speaking a different language, one they have not yet learned. You begin to vibrate at a frequency they have not yet reached, and instead of rising to meet you, their fear whispers that you are abandoning them. It tells them that your growth is a betrayal, that your strength is a judgment, that your distance is rejection. Even when your intentions remain pure, people who once walked beside you might begin to feel as if you are walking away from them, even when you aren't. They feel the space widening, not because you've pushed them out, but because they've chosen not to step forward with you. The same comfort they once found in your shared limitations now becomes discomfort in your transformation. They remember the version of you that tolerated dysfunction, that doubted yourself, that second-guessed every decision. That version made them feel secure, seen, understood. But the new you, the one who has learned self-respect, who now says no without guilt, who demands peace and integrity, makes them question their own refusal to change. This fear of being left behind is not always loud. It doesn't always result in fights or harsh words. More often, it takes the form of withdrawal, of avoidance, of passivity. You notice they stop asking about your life. They no longer celebrate your wins. They begin to minimize your efforts or make backhanded comments that leave a strange aftertaste. These reactions are not about jealousy in the traditional sense. They are about grief over the loss of familiarity, over the bond that once relied on mutual limitation. Your growth breaks the silent contract you once had with them, the one where both of you agreed, consciously or unconsciously, to stay in a certain place emotionally, psychologically, or spiritually. When you start becoming the person you were always meant to be, those who are only attached to your former self cannot help but feel displaced. They fear that your rising means their irrelevance, that your strength means they are now weak by comparison, that your clarity is a judgment against their confusion. But none of this is about you personally. It is about what you represent. You symbolize what they have not yet dared to pursue. You are a living reminder that staying the same is a choice, and that realization is far more terrifying than any argument or confrontation, and so they retreat, not because they hate you, but because staying close to you would mean facing themselves. It would mean feeling the discomfort of their unfulfilled dreams, their postponed healing, their silent compromises. It is easier for them to pull away and blame the distance on you than it is to admit they are afraid of what your evolution demands of them. They want the old version of you to return, the one that required less courage, less truth, less authenticity, but you cannot go back. You did not grow to hurt them, but neither can you shrink to soothe them. And that silent distance becomes the cost of choosing your own becoming over the comfort of staying small. There comes a point in your journey when you begin to realize that not everyone is meant to walk beside you forever. Some connections, no matter how deep they once felt, are only designed to last through certain chapters of your life. As you grow, as you evolve emotionally, spiritually, mentally, and even energetically, you will begin to feel the natural unraveling of relationships that were only ever aligned with the older version of who you were. This process is often not dramatic, not marked by arguments or betrayal, but by a slow, quiet drifting that is no less painful for its subtlety. And in that drifting, you come to see that outgrowing people is not cruelty, it is clarity. It is the inevitable result of stepping more fully into who you truly are. Some people loved the version of you who was unsure of yourself, who asked for permission, who bent over backwards to avoid conflict, who kept your truth locked behind your teeth just to keep the peace. They were comfortable with your insecurities because your self-doubt made their own limitations feel more acceptable. But when you start to heal, when you begin to reclaim your voice, when you stop explaining your worth and start embodying it, something begins to shift in the dynamics that once felt safe. What was once mutual now feels imbalanced. The roles begin to crumble. The emotional contracts that once kept the relationship alive no longer apply, and the ones who only knew how to love your wounds may not know how to love your healing. This change does not mean they are bad people. It simply means that the connection was rooted in a version of you that no longer exists. When you were operating from pain, You attracted people who resonated with that same frequency. You bonded over shared struggles, mirrored insecurities, or the unspoken agreement that neither of you would push too far into the discomfort of growth. But as you begin to rise, not in superiority, but in self-awareness, you disrupt that unspoken balance. You begin to crave conversations that go deeper, energy that nourishes rather than drains, presence that feels safe rather than suffocating. And not everyone will be able or willing to meet you there. The letting go doesn't always feel fair. Sometimes it happens with people you loved deeply, people who were once your entire support system, people who stood beside you through moments you thought you'd never survive. But love, in its truest form, does not cling to what is no longer aligned. It does not demand that you dim your light to keep others from squinting. And so the most painful form of love becomes the one where you choose to walk away, not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring about yourself enough to no longer stay in spaces that ask you to shrink. There will be guilt, especially if you are someone who values loyalty, someone who once believed that keeping people in your life, no matter what, was a measure of strength. But loyalty without alignment becomes a cage. Staying connected out of obligation becomes a betrayal to your own becoming. True connection evolves as you evolve. If it doesn't, then what you are holding on to is not a relationship, but a memory of one. And memories, while beautiful, are not a foundation for growth. This is the silent truth of transformation. Not everyone can follow where you're going. And that's not your fault. You are not required to take everyone with you. Some will remain stuck in the stories you've outgrown, in the cycles you've broken, in the patterns you've healed from, and your continued presence in their lives only reinforces those old identities. Sometimes the most compassionate thing you can do, for yourself and for them, is to release the bond with gratitude, not resentment, to honor what was without trying to force it into what no longer fits. You don't owe your past self a future filled with people who cannot meet the person you're becoming, so if you find yourself suddenly disliked, misunderstood, or silently opposed, pause but do not shrink. Let the hidden war be seen not as an attack, but as a revelation. People's rejection often marks your transformation. Their silence is a testament to your new resonance. Let it be. Remember this: what others hate about you may be the very thing you had to fight hardest to become. Do not betray yourself for the comfort of those still at war with their own becoming. Walk on quietly, fiercely, and freely.